Now that you understand the basics of Laravel's service container, we can finally move on to framework facades. So have a look. We've learned that in a controller action, if you need to return a view, we can use this helper function here. However, we could also write this in a slightly different way, using a view facade. So I can import this, and we'll say make welcome. And if I now switch to my browser and reload, we get the same thing. Okay, so this is the first thing to understand. This and this are functionally identical. They do the exact same thing, and there's no measurable benefit to choosing one over the other. It's only a preference. Okay, but let's continue on with this. So if I take a look at this class, it'll look a little confusing. So let's take a look. Class view, and already I don't see that make method that we just referenced. View make, we take a look again, nowhere to be found. Instead, all I see is this reference to get facade accessor. But now if I scroll up, I do see a reference here. So it looks like there is some kind of static method called make I could use, but again, this doesn't look like any class I'm used to. Okay, let's talk about it. Now first, you'll see that this view class is stored within your vendor directory, meaning it was pulled in through Composer. Okay, so if we look at Illuminate Support Facades, here's all the default facades that are included with the framework. And there's tons of stuff here related to performing authentication, or working with cache, or configuration, or sending mail or notifications, or working with the request, or the validator. There's tons of stuff going on here. In fact, most of the framework is accessible through these, if you wish. So here's the deal. These facades provide what is effectively a static interface to underlying components in the framework. That's it. That's all there is to it. They are a convenience that you can reference without having to manually build up these objects and their dependency chains. It's useful. So if I go back to Pages controller, all I have to do is call view make, and behind the scenes, come along for the ride here, this view factory is being referenced and a make method is being called. But you didn't have to instantiate that factory, and you didn't have to pass in all the dependencies that this object requires. Instead, you don't care about that, you just want to make a view. And this is what separates facades in Laravel from a traditional static method. So as you may know, calling a static method that changes state is generally and widely frowned upon. And that's because if it's globally accessible and it's changing state, you can end up with a house of spaghetti, and it ends up being really, really hard to test. However, facades in Laravel, even though you're still calling a static method, it's not the same thing. Any of these facades are still entirely testable in the same way as if you injected their underlying classes. So let me show you another example. Let's say right here, we're going to fetch some item in the query string. So once again, we've learned to use this helper function here. So we'll say name, and all I'm going to do is return that. So if we come back to Firefox and I add name equals John, sure enough, we grabbed that value and we returned it as a response. So once again, like that view helper function, this is identical to pulling in the underlying facade. We're going to grab the input for name and return it. So if I come back and give it a refresh, once again, it's the same thing. So this time, let's take a look at the request facade. All right, here we go. So once again, I'm not seeing any of these methods. We called an input method, but I don't see it defined here. I just see, once again, this awkward get facade accessor method that we don't really understand. But sure enough, if I scroll up, I can see lots of methods I can reference here, including input. All right, so let's get to the bottom of this. In your facade, this method right here, and as it turns out, every facade will include this method. So for example, let's go to the log facade, get facade accessor. Let's go to, how about redirect, get facade accessor. They all include it. Okay, let's go back to request. So each of these methods will return a key that references a binding in the service container. And you learned about this a bit in the previous episode, where we talked about service containers. So for example, if I boot up PHP Artisan Tinker, you already know that you can bind any given key into the container. Like so. So now if I resolve key out of the container, we get the corresponding value. So in this example here, we could say the binding in the service container is called key, and that key corresponds to this result. All right, so here, for the request facade, the binding in the service container is called request. Let's see if we can do it. Resolve request. And there we go. Illuminate HTTP request. So notice that this, if we scroll up, is the same as this. This C directive is kind of a makeshift directive, refers to the underlying class or classes. So I know it's a little confusing, but is that starting to make sense? When you say request input, this is a static interface that proxies to an underlying class. And in this case, that underlying class is Illuminate HTTP request. So I bet if we dig in there, we will find an input method. There it is. This is the method that's being called. Let's review another one because it's really important we understand this. Let's go into File. All right, so this is the file facade. It allows us to work, of course, with various files and directories. We can read a file. We can check if it's writable. We can grab the extension. We can copy or move a file. Tons of stuff here. So let's see. If we go into our, how about the public directory? Why don't we read, here's the entry point into the framework. Let's just read it using the file system class or the file facade. PHP Artisan Tinker, file, and if I want to get the contents of a file, I can use the method get. So I'm going to look in our public directory, and there's a little helper function called public path I can use. And as it turns out, there's a lot of those functions. For example, base path will give me the path to our base application. I could go to app path. I could go to resource path. There's lots of stuff there. In our case, we want to go into the public directory and then read index.php. And sure enough, we have read this file and spit out the results. Okay, so once again, you used the file facade there. But if we go back to it now, we can see it's available here as a static method. But if we come back, yeah, it's not there again, and we've already learned why. This facade isn't doing the work. Its only purpose is to proxy your calls to the underlying class. So have a look. Get facade accessor. It looks like the key or the binding in the service container has a name of files. Let's try it out. I'm going to resolve out of the container that has a key of files. And sure enough, we get Illuminate file system. And if you scroll up, there it is. Okay, so that means if you're ever trying to debug file get, and you take a look at that file class and you don't really know where to go, well, here you can see the underlying class is file system. So you could visit that and then look for your get method. All right, so let's talk a little bit more, a couple of things to be aware of. So let's say here, we're going to do file right there. I'll import that. And actually, real quick, you can import that full class path, or there's also a global alias you could reference. But in general, I usually import it. Okay, so if I were to do the exact same thing again, only as an example, we're going to read a file and then spit it out as a response. So if I come back and give this a refresh, there's the contents of that file. Now, alternatively, what we could do is inject it through the method or through the constructor. And again, you learned about this in the last episode where we talked about automatic resolution. So in this case, if we know the underlying class is the file system, well, why don't we just inject that or ask for it? So I can either pull this in or I can pull in the contract. Laravel will compensate either way. But let's be concrete right now. Okay, so now I've asked for an instance of file system. And as you learned in the last episode, Laravel will read this and automatically resolve and pass in the correct argument. All right, so now I'm not using the facade anymore. I'm just going to say file get. And if I come back to Firefox, I still get the same thing. And that's because whether I do this or this, it's the exact same method being called. But notice with this approach, the facade approach, I didn't have to construct any objects on the fly. I didn't have to inject it through the constructor. And as a result, we end up with a slightly more terse and expressive syntax. And like we discussed, there are facades for basically the entire framework. So let's say we are going to work with caching. We haven't talked about this yet, but I could say we're going to, and let's go with remember. We will remember something in the cache. foo for 60 seconds. And then we'll just do shorthand here, foobar. This is arrow functions in PHP 7.4. It's identical to this one. Same thing, but a bit more streamlined. All right, so we've written foo to the cache. Let's now read from the cache. Cache get foo. And with any luck, we should get foobar. So if I come back to Firefox, this isn't a review of caching yet. We'll cover that later. But sure enough, it does work. And yet again, we are using the cache facade to interact with the underlying repository. So if we take a look at repository, you'll see there's your remember method, and there is your get method. So I'm starting to repeat myself, but it's important that we drill this in. All this is a static interface that proxies to the underlying class. You wanted to work with caching, but you didn't have to figure out how to construct the cache. You didn't have to request it with dependency injection. You could instead instantly begin using it. Okay, so I'm going to end with a small warning. Yes, this is convenient. However, be careful that this convenience doesn't end up biting you. And here's what I mean by that. One big benefit to defining all of a class's dependencies within the constructor is that it makes it instantly clear what is required in order for this class to function. However, when you instead have these Laravel facades sprinkled throughout the class, it blurs things a little bit. You know what I mean? If this class is 300-400 lines long, maybe you're referencing 4 or 5 or 6 different facades, and everything starts to get out of hand, but you didn't really notice it because it was tucked away into these underlying methods. Sometimes when you're a little more explicit about your dependencies, it instantly becomes clear. You look at the constructor and you think, oh, there's 5 or 6 or 7 different dependencies. There's too much going on here. I probably need to extract a different class or collaborator. Again, defining your dependencies in the constructor helps with that, whereas tucking them away in the various methods makes it a little more difficult to see what dependencies your class has. So that's definitely something to think about. And I think you'll find when to reach for them versus when to reach for the underlying classes, it just sort of comes from experience. So for example, I all the time am using the view helper function, whether it's this form or this. They're still doing the same thing here. So if you take a look at this, we are resolving the underlying class, and then we are deferring. It's the same thing as your view facade. This is telling you what is the key in the underlying class. Resolve it out of the container, and then proxy to that method call. Same thing. So personally, I have no issue here. I have no problem with using the redirect helper or the redirect facade. It all just depends on the scope of your project, the conventions you're following, and where in the stack you are referencing these classes. So for example, on the model level, if I have an eloquent model, I'm probably not reaching for the auth facade, or I probably would never reach for the request facade in my model. That sort of feels like the opposite direction in my mind. But yeah, as always, rules are meant to be broken. So my recommendation is play around with this, and at some point you probably will hit some pitfalls where you realize, maybe I should pull back there. I like referencing maybe the file facade when I need to do quick reads from an artisan command, but if I build a package, I would instead inject it. These are all things that come from experience.